So welcome everyone for this IDnext lunch break initiated by IDnext. It will be the last in the session which we had in the past, but we still will have new IDnext lunch breaks in the future. It's currently being planned for the next coming period of time, and we will certainly inform you about when those are going to be there. But first, I'm not sure everyone do know IDnext. Probably you do, but still, we do exist 10 years. Last year we had our anniversary, and the main mission really of IDnext is all about sharing knowledge. So when we started 10 years ago, our main goal was to bring experts and professionals in the world of digital identity together and to share knowledge and information experience regarding digital identity in a broad definition of digital identity. And the way we do is by organizing all kinds of events, workshops, masterclasses, and also we started already last year with the IDnext lunch break, an online session where we have one team, one guest, and some interesting content to discuss with each other. IDnext itself, like I mentioned, is an open and independent platform. We are there to support and facilitate innovative approaches, and we also are there for creating awareness about digital identity. If you would like to have more information about IDnext, please feel free to reach out to me or Suzanne, or go into the website there where you will find the relevant information. But well, I'm not the special guest today. That's really Paul Timmers, who's going to share his vision and expertise about digital strategic autonomy. We already know Paul for a number of years. He worked in the past also for European Commission, and I'm glad that he will share next, let's say 35 minutes or maybe 40 minutes about this interesting topic. You can ask questions, please use the chat or raise your hand via the Teams, and we certainly will make sure that Paul will answer these questions, or maybe during the session or after the session. And we certainly will try to keep some time left after the session for any Q&A. So Paul.
Thank you, Robert. I hope that you hear me well, and I will in a minute share my presentation. So first of all, Robert and Suzanne, many thanks for inviting me. I know of IDnext already since a long time, of course, actually since my time in the European Commission, and you have built up a reputation of consistency and sustaining in this topic of electronic identity, digital identity, which has only become more important. I will come back to that a little bit. Perhaps good to add, not only is it a pleasure for me that I can share some of my insights of the last few years when I have been working, amongst others, as a researcher at the University of Oxford and a professor at the European University Cyprus, but also out of my experience as a policy maker at the European Commission, where I was responsible for a range of topics as a director in the digital department there, amongst others in my team, of course, with champions that were there, that were doing the real work, was the eIDAS regulation, also the first cybersecurity legislation at the European level, and other forms of quite a lot of other laws and legislative initiatives, and also responsibility for research and innovation and deployment in digital matters, ranging really from digital health to self-driving cars to e-government, a range of topics. Anyway, I do a lot of work on cybersecurity, and from my association with Oxford, where I'm at the department, where I was at the Department of Politics and International Relations, I'm now at the Oxford Internet Institute. There's a lot of interest there, of course, for the international dimension of cybersecurity, and more than that, as a matter of fact, for what is happening around the topic of sovereignty and strategic autonomy. And these are topics that have come up in the discussions very much in the last few years and have also been the subject of my research. So I will say a little bit about that and use also some very recent reporting. So let me see if I can get to sharing my screen. And like in your case, Robert, that it also works properly if I do present it. Oops, let me see. Do you see my screen? Or do you see... wait a minute. Let me see. What choose?
See slide, Paul.
Sorry, do you see full screen slide?
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
Yes.
about
Okay.
sovereignty on a threat in the digital world. That's the slide that I see.
Great, that's the intention. Thanks a lot. So let me go ahead. I will talk about sovereignty under threat in the digital world. The picture that you here see is of the Treaty of Westphalia, which is 1648, which was kind of like for a number of people the start of the definitions around sovereignty and the thinking about state sovereignty, and actually the start of more or less the foundations of the modern state. I will not go too deep into the philosophy of sovereignty, but it's good to see this also in historic perspective. So what I'm going to talk about is sovereignty under threat, and I will say a little bit what these threats are in the geopolitical, digital, and cyber domain. Strategic autonomy, what are we talking about? And the way you could analyze issues around strategic autonomy and digital. And then I will address the network and information security legislation. So say the first forms of cyber legislation that you have in Europe, but I hope there are also participants here from outside Europe that they feel addressed by this. I'll make a short side note about EU treaties, talk about the Digital Markets Act and eID, and get to some conclusion. Now, the new political reality is that if you talk about sovereignty, that it is very much under threat. State sovereignty, I'm talking about, not, let's say, personal sovereignty. And it's under threat because of geopolitical developments, disruption in and the pervasiveness of digital across economy and society and democracy, the disruptive effects of that, and also dominance of digital platforms that we see there that are really sometimes at par with what states can do as in terms of sovereignty, and of course cyber threats. So some people are saying that state sovereignty is to this extent under threat that really the international system that we know of, which is based upon sovereign states, itself is under threat. That certain states are continuously doing essentially warfare under the radar, you might say. It's a situation which is called UNPEACE, so continuous disturbance, which is not at the level of war, but which is also ultimately as disruptive as warfare. Others are saying, well, there are states that are not behaving according to the rules of the international system of states, like North Korea, for example. And then there are also new actors coming, and that is both kind of actors that are perhaps acting as proxies for states, or perhaps terrorist organizations that are active in the cyber domain, but also really new actors is the private sector, which, as I said, are sometimes as important as states. So this new political reality says that there is a gap for states to protect their sovereignty. And this has really become an issue, Chefsache, an issue that is discussed at the top of states. Merkel is talking about it, Macron is talking about it, essentially the Chinese are talking about it, the Russians, the Americans. It's very much in the picture since the last 3 years. And summits like at the European level, where all the leaders are coming together, really have this as a second topic just after COVID. So these geopolitical threats, they have really increased a lot to the extent that this sovereignty is under threat, is felt to be under threat. And for Western countries, these kind of threats are mainly coming from China and Russia, but also really under the Trump era, America first, the transatlantic tensions have been significant and are perhaps still significant. And let's see what happens in the somewhat longer run when we have elections again in the United States. How are we stable partners or not? Not everybody is convinced of that. And must also be said that China and Russia also recently have been showing all the signs that indeed there are threats for European sovereignty, for example. So they are not letting off with cyber attacks and other forms of suppression or what have you. Geopolitical is also that there is a divided Europe. In Europe, if we look at that context, and of course I will be mainly talking about what is happening in Europe, we have seen Brexit, and there has been a lot of flag waving around Brexit that this is really about sovereignty, whatever it means. Europe is also divided. It's not one unity. Not everybody has the same view about collaborating in Europe. So these geopolitical tensions are likely not going to go away in the short term. And then in the digital side, you see some of these kind of sovereignty threatening developments. Lots of concerns, for example, about cloud. The cloud is really the underpinning of economy and society and democracy at scale. Ever more, there's also a lot of innovation happening linked to the cloud. Think of artificial intelligence, but also think of the use of electronic identity to access that and the related data. And the European cloud market is largely, really largely in the hands of companies from the United States and Chinese companies. And we know that some of these companies also, well, all of these companies to an extent have to obey the jurisdiction of their home base. And to some extent, this is also quite worrying in terms of, for example, access to data. But it's not only that, it's also the fact that a lot of this value added that is coming from smart analysis in the cloud is then in the hands of companies that are not in Europe. And you see, for example, electronic identity, to talk about that topic, is very much captured by Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. In the threats in the sense of cyber, we are spanning across economy, society, and democracy. It's about influencing elections. We have seen these kind of things. You all know about it. It's large-scale digital extortion, ransomware, and there's also compromising foundational trust, as we have seen recently in the theft of certificates, keys, attacks on hardware and firmware, up to and including into the depth of, for example, the systems that are controlling our industrial systems or our electricity, the SCADA systems. And supply chain attacks as one of the most recent developments. And the SolarWinds case and the Microsoft Exchange case are recent, quite worrying threats that go almost like to the foundations of society, what we are based upon. And in the Netherlands, for example, the security services, intelligence and security services, have once again been warning that a lot of the intellectual property that is valuable is actually stolen by means of these cyber intrusions. And so that's undermining the longer term future of that country. And it's not the only one. Well, this I think you all know, but it's good perhaps to put it together in one picture. So let's step back. What are we actually talking about? So this sovereignty thing that people are talking so much about, what is it that they actually mean? And then, of course, if you look into the world of political sciences, there isn't a single definition for that. There are many views on that, and you can expect that because that's the nature of this type of sciences. But when people are talking about it, it's about territory, it's about the natural resources that kind of belong to us. It's about the people that are in a nation. It's about authority, recognition. It's the internal legitimacy, which is between the state and the citizens. And external legitimacy is that a state is recognized by other states. And with technology, increasingly, almost all of this is actually changing, and sometimes under threat, but certainly changing. So, for example, natural resources that belong to us, the European Commissioner Breton, who is responsible for the digital agenda, said, well, you know, these kind of industrial data and health data, well, they really belong to us, isn't it? So this belonging to us is an expression of sovereignty. It's considered for some as sovereign data. And then you have this notion of strategic autonomy, which has come up a lot. And here is a definition that it is the capacities and the capabilities that you can decide and act upon the essential aspect of your longer term future, and this in the economy, society, and democracy. So strategic autonomy is really kind of like when you might say when sovereignty is the objective, strategic autonomy is the means. How do you realize sovereignty? You need to have some kind of means for that, isn't it? So you need to have some capabilities and capacities, and this can be kind of political. You are part of a wider union, you work together with others, you have the industrial capacity, you have, well, nowadays in Europe, they are talking about materials autonomy, energy strategic autonomy, health strategic autonomy, digital strategic autonomy. You know, you can put this label on many aspects that you consider essential for your future. The important thing here is this definition is actually coming originally from definitions based upon that are coming from the military domain, because, you know, defense always has sovereignty as its primary objective, the defense of sovereignty. But of course, they are talking about the defense capacities and capabilities. But here, we are talking about all those that are essential for your economy, society, and democracy. And I think that's a change in the past. We now see that also democracy, for example, through fake news, Cambridge Analytica scandals and those kind of things is threatened, and that's threatening the foundations of the state and the internal legitimacy and also external legitimacy. So if you then ask people, so how do you realize actually strategic autonomy? What is it that you do? Basically, you can do everything on your own, but that's kind of perhaps possible for the United States and for China. But apart from that option, this is not a realistic option for Europe or Australia or Latin America or Africa or most countries in Asia. So then there are three possibilities that you have. You can kind of do the best that you can do. It's risk management. So you try to do the best defense of your sovereignty, and your strategic autonomy approach is a risk management approach. The best you can do according to state of the art. And you keep your fingers crossed that it doesn't go wrong. And that's sometimes worrying. For example, the systematic theft of intellectual property is if you look at that and you kind of try to do the best, it's a risk management approach, but in the long run, your economy may be totally undermined. There are two other approaches. You can do strategic partnerships. You only buy and use the stuff from those countries and those private sector actors that you trust, with whom you have a strategic partnership. And perhaps with those that you do not trust, you can have strategic interdependency, like you have a mutual lose-lose if things would go wrong. And strategic partnerships are very much on the rise. This is kind of like the name of the game today. And when you do this and you still stay open for trade and for strategic interdependency with not like-minded parties, you can call it open strategic autonomy. This is a term that is strategic partnerships plus strategic interdependency, which is used a lot in Europe. The third approach is that you kind of stand above this and you say, what we're really talking about is defending a global common good, a common interest at a global level. Take the domain name system. That should be an international, a global common interest, a global common good. And that's also like in the origins of the internet. And you can work together then with international partners globally to defend those kind of assets. And as a matter of fact, paradoxically, I can explain that later, it's actually better for your sovereignty if you do it that way. So if we look at it a little bit in the context of what is happening in Europe, apologies to those that are not from Europe, but the risk management approach is really what has been followed largely in policy and legislation so far. So the Network and Information Security Directive, the cyber legislation, their risk management approach, the General Data Protection Regulation, the Digital Markets Act, they're really kind of like risk management approaches. Strategic partnerships, so where you only work together with like-minded parties, is very much in the foreign direct investment regulation. You can exclude foreign investments because they are not from like-minded partners. For some reason, they are a threat for your sovereignty. And perhaps let's speculate about the revision of eIDAS, the electronic ID and trust services regulation that is to come. Perhaps it's also a strategic partnership approach. I will come back to that. But global common good approach, the global common interest, well, until recently, the European R&D programs were like that. They even said, we are open to the world. You know, whereas it's sensitive R&D sometimes that is developed. 5G, Internet of Things, was global common goods. The global domain name system was global common goods. Now, so if we have a bit of a picture, hopefully, then if you ultimately want to develop some kind of policy around digital autonomy, strategic autonomy. So digital autonomy is really strategic autonomy in the digital domain, applied to anything that's digital. Then you can do analysis. And one of the ways to do this analysis I propose here is based upon a study that I, together with a colleague, recently did for the Dutch government. that analyzes certain triggers that are coming up, like the merger and acquisition, the takeover of a critical company, or a trigger that you see, for example, suddenly realizing that there is a dominance in the cloud world of foreign companies. And then you need to analyze what is the market dynamics. You describe that as a case, what is happening, and then you come to your strategic autonomy objectives. And that's critical. What is it that you actually want to control? What is it that you would like to achieve? Because strategic autonomy is about control. And then you can do policy interventions. We have developed a model for that, which is analyzing where do you want to maintain control, where you have a degree of control, or gain control on companies. How do you monitor for changes that are happening, perhaps across a sector, like, let's say, the trust services sector? And how can you analyze gaps also towards the future with emerging technologies? Say, the emergence of quantum computing and post-quantum encryption. And you can combine that with a market analysis, which is based upon, which some people may know. Michael Porter has been developing models in the 70s, 80s, 90s around competitiveness and the competition between companies and competitiveness of a country. How do you develop policy against a wider context? Because it's not about a single item like electronic ID, it's about a whole ecosystem perhaps, and you have to understand how that ecosystem works, and you are certainly the specialist in that. Let me make a little step. If you now develop policy and you want to protect your strategic autonomy, and let's focus for a minute on digital strategic autonomy, and you are a policymaker at the European level, you always have to wonder, can I actually really act? Can I take any kind of measure, legislation or investment in research and innovation that is helpful? And therefore, you need to have a mandate in the treaties, in the European treaties. And now, if you look up the European treaties, it's actually quite peculiar. They do not mention sovereignty. Well, they mention it once in the context of some kind of bases in Cyprus that are owned by the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom is anyway no longer a member of the EU. So sovereignty is not there. Quite interesting. Even though it's all about sharing and pooling sovereignty to some extent. And more than that, when the state is threatened, you very quickly, sovereignty threats like cybersecurity attacks or the capture of electronic identity by foreign companies, you're talking about things that are getting very close to the heart of the state and perhaps very close to national security. But the European treaties actually exclude national security. You cannot act at European level when it's national security. It's the prerogative of the member states. So really, can you do anything? And if you look at it, indeed, I will not explain this complicated diagram. You can find it in one of the background articles, but it lists which parts out of the European treaties, which articles can you use to defend what. And well, you can do a reasonable job when you're using the internal market legal basis, as it is called. It's the free flow of people, goods and services. As the basis for example, proposing law, because you can argue, if, let's say, the energy network in the Netherlands goes down, it will create a ripple effect and stability across all of the European internal market, and therefore you can act at European level and demand that cyber attacks on such critical infrastructures are dealt with through European legislation and are dealt with in collaboration. But you cannot do everything. Let's just mention an example. Let me take the last example, education. Education is under threat, cyber threats. There's theft of information about our very own kids that are using online platforms. There is misinformation in the education sphere. The platforms that are used in education are largely non-European platforms. There's no control on it. There's really little legal basis in the treaties to act on the defending education, defending domain names to some extent, defending intellectual property, hardly. So no wonder that we are struggling to defend intellectual property at the European level. But you can do something. I mean, first of all, it has to be understood that sovereignty in a certain way understood, can actually be really something which is not a win-lose. It's not so that if you win sovereignty at the European level, you lose it at the national level. It can actually be a triple win. Why? Well, first of all, the threats are often now of a nature that you cannot defend yourself any longer at the national level. Countries are too small. You have to collaborate. And in fact, your national sovereignty will be stronger when you collaborate internationally with like-minded partners, like in the European Union or with other states that are like-minded across the world. And in cybersecurity, it's very clear. That's absolutely evident. Most countries are too small to defend themselves. Secondly, you build up really sovereign assets. Think again about that notion of the things that belong to us. So eID belongs to us. .eu belongs to us. And who's us? Well, it's not a single country, but it's actually all of the citizens and companies in Europe for .eu. Data spaces that are coming up, they are owned, they are a sovereign asset in the European Union, these European data spaces, and the same will hold in other countries also. And then thirdly, think about this external legitimacy being recognized in the world. Well, that only will happen if you're also strong at home. Otherwise, you don't have a voice in the world. So you will have to team up to build a stronger position at home to be strong in the world. So for now, we can use the European treaties to increase our cyber resilience and our digital strategic autonomy at European level jointly in a triple win fashion. But it may not be enough. We have the internal market legal basis, but in the long run, we will also probably need to think about revising the treaties. So I'm getting to, this was actually the example that is closest related to cybersecurity around the Network and Information Security Directive. And that's European legislation to defend critical infrastructures against cyber incidents and cyber attacks. And that legislation has recently been revised and extended. There is another piece of legislation that is on the table now, which is the Digital Markets Act, and a lot is being talked about that. So that's another example I want to use to illustrate digital autonomy. So the Digital Market Act is really a shift from looking at what is happening in electronic marketplaces, search engines, social media networks. It's a shift from dealing with those after they are already operating, which is called exposed competition policy. So you look at it, is there distortion of competition? Is there abuse of dominant position? Are there unfair market conditions? You look at that, that's the normal kind of competition policy approach, and that's where you get these kind of high profile competition cases. It's actually shifting that towards let's regulate what can be done in these platforms before ex ante, so before the act. And that's a very, very significant shift for people who are in this kind of business. So far, in the liberal market economy thinking that we have had in Europe very much, it was open to the world, and the markets are regulating things, are arranging best for what has to happen, and if it goes wrong, we'll use competition policy interventions. This is a shift in thinking because it's about ex ante regulation. The focus there is limited because it's on the gatekeeper platforms. They are defined as very large platforms, and it's to reduce their lock-in and possible abuse of dominant position. One of the things that is probably interesting in the context of IDnext, of your platform, is that essentially this piece of legislation at European level, which is still to be negotiated, asks to unbundle, for example, identity management. So the access and using identity as an access to these platforms, and the linkage that is then happening through ID to the data, to unbundle that. It's not kind of saying you cannot use, the platform identity, but it's saying that has to be unbundled. There has to be room for other identity systems too. And if that's regulated by law, that's a very important change, because you all know how important identity, eID, is as an entry point to the personal data and getting value from these data. So this is really a strategic autonomy challenge, even though it's not explicitly called like that. But really, why is it a strategic autonomy challenge? Because it's getting very close to something that has become so important, these gatekeeper platforms, to participate to economy, society, or democracy, that they are touching the heart of what the sovereign state is about. And it's felt that the conditions are now determined by a number of the very large players, who are simply not under democratic control because they are simply market operators, or they are under foreign control, but they are not under control of the citizens themselves in Europe. And then the other example, the eIDAS. So eIDAS being the regulation at European level that is about electronic ID and assurance services like e-signature, website authentication. I assume you're very familiar with that law, and it's now up for revision. So I think it was adopted in 2014. And there has, as always at the European level, you then start looking at it, how well does this legislation actually work? And there are quite some concerns about it because it's in place, but only about half of the member states have actually notified their electronic ID, their national electronic ID at the European level, so that you can use it across from other countries. It's having a limited take-up, so it is being used, electronic ID, some countries more than in other countries. I mean, the country that I'm living in, Belgium, is, I think, very good in that because you see it everywhere. It's very practically accessible, but in other countries it's far less, and using it across borders is still not very smooth. In fact, what we have seen is that also in electronic ID, these platforms have started to play a very important role, and they are probably more important in many cases than the government-issued electronic ID. So you see the Facebook, Google, Microsoft IDs being used in order to sign into the electronic world, and the electronic world has become, the digital world has become so much an underpinning of economy, society, and democracy that even for public services and also for the tight coupling to personal data, it's the platform ID that has become the entry point. So that eID, which really also identifies citizens, that's actually historically a core function of the state. As the French call it, un fonction régalien. As who is your citizen is really something that is almost one-to-one with the definition of what is the state about, what is sovereignty. And this is starting, governments feel, is starting to slip out of their hands. And we are faced with these problems that their answer to it, electronic ID as issued by national governments, isn't really getting the traction that was hoped for. There's a limited and slow take-up. And so the realization has kicked in increasingly that electronic ID and there are the related trust services like electronic signature and other trust services, they are really essential for sovereignty and strategic autonomy. You have to have a degree of control on it. But they are increasingly escaping from the hands of governments. So it is a strategic autonomy challenge, and it's explicitly formulated as such. And you can see it also from the statement of the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who said in her State of the Union in September 2020, we as the European Commission propose a secure European electronic identity where we can control ourselves what data and how data is used. So the key word here is twofold. It's, of course, European electronic identity and control, especially control. Control is everything. Has everything to do with strategic autonomy. So this is an example where you see legislation that originally was really in the risk management sphere of strategic autonomy. We'll do our best, and we hope that it goes well, and it did go well, but not well enough. Is now moving into the sphere of this is something that belongs to us, and we need to have it more under control, and the impact that electronic ID has. So this is one of these examples where you see that strategic autonomy has become more important and is starting to become more explicitly a guidance for policy development at European level. And I think that's a theme. That is where I will end on. Where are we heading then? So what are the conclusions and the next step when we talk about strategic autonomy? And I think I'm still kind of okay in time. Yeah. First of all, strategic autonomy, sovereignty, they are difficult beasts. You know, there are no simple answers on the degree of strategic autonomy that you want to have, and even not on the interpretation of sovereignty. So you really have to carefully consider when you make policy in these areas. Countries are not living on an island. They have to think about their place in the world. They have to think as state to their relationship to citizens and the pros and the cons. And it's also becoming ever more evident that it's not a single law or a single research program or a single international treaty that will fix strategic autonomy challenges. You really need to think about integrated and proactive policy. And you need to think about these three possibilities. You have risk management possibility, you have the possibility to work with strategic partners, and you can try to bring the challenge to the global level. And all three approaches are valid and may have to be used in combination. So you need to consider an integrated policy, and you also need to be proactive, reacting after the facts and observing that, you know, the larger part of the cloud market has been captured by foreign players is a late observation. The train has left the station. So you need to be more proactive in this. And that's quite challenging for all of us, and certainly also for policymakers. But it also holds for electronic ID. So we may think about strengthening European legislation, like eIDAS in the revision, but it's not enough. We need to think about if you want to have sufficient grip on this essential facility, this sovereign function, you need to have a smart approach of sensible law and not too much of it, but the right degree of it. But you also need to have an economic ecosystem in which trust services can develop, in which your semiconductor industry can develop, if that is providing essential hardware for electronic identification and trust services. You need to think about integrating these new approaches like self-sovereign identity and emerging technologies. And also certainly think about international promotion and standardization. And that's really difficult. You know, it means that you're asking, in policy terms, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs to work together with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And well, anyone who has worked in these organizations knows that this is not easy. You ask private and public sector to work together, and anyone in this business knows that it's also not easy, but it must be done. That's the only way that can work. The other thing is that for many, perhaps even also for you as participants, you think, well, this is all a lot of talk, you know, the strategic autonomy debate, but isn't it a bit irrealistic? And indeed, it's time to become pretty sober about strategic autonomy, and also in the EU. So there are a number of kind of fallacies or misstatements or wrong assumptions there. So for a few, perhaps 2 years, we had this debate that at every meeting people said, but strategic autonomy does not mean self-sufficiency. No, it does not mean self-sufficiency. It has never been said. Autarky is just a red herring. Don't go into the autarky debate, I would say, because that's not what we are talking about. Europe will not be self-sufficient in all the areas that are necessary for strategic autonomy. And it's not about that either, because that's not what generally people in Europe want. Secondly, as we have seen also in the Brexit debate, this notion of taking control back, which has been used as a slogan, is largely a fallacy. What control? What are you talking about? There's maybe nothing that you can take control back on. So the example of the hyperscalers in cloud, the Gaia X initiative is not about taking back control on the hyperscalers, the large-scale data storage and networking. No, it's about the next generation, about what is the added value, what are the trust services, what is assurance there, what is the added value in terms of data analytics and artificial intelligence. So that's not taking back control, it's about the next 10 years, what's still to come. It's not about the past, it's about the future. And thirdly, it will cost a lot, strategic autonomy. You cannot have it all. You cannot have the cake and eat it. If you want to be open, then you will have to give in something somewhere. If you want to have strategic autonomy in materials, in automotive, in energy, in digital, in artificial intelligence, in quantum, in health and go on and go on. Well, I challenge you, give me how much it will cost and add it up, you will see it will not be affordable. And finally then, I think strategic autonomy is really Chefsache, as the Germans call it. It's really a topic that is at the top of governments. Just in the last 3 weeks, there were letters sent by, amongst others, Merkel and 3 other heads of state about strategic autonomy, digital strategic autonomy, and they mentioned their priorities. A week later, there was a letter by 12 countries sent at the European level. It is part of the Look Up the White House Emerging and Critical Technologies document. It's explicitly about strategic autonomy and the approaches that are chosen for the United States. It has become Chefsache. The geopolitical tensions will not go away. The digital developments go on. The cyber developments, the cyber threats will not decrease. It will stay with us for a long time. So actually, I think strategic autonomy will become a major driver of digital policy making, including in electronic identity, certainly in Europe, but I would think across the world. So with that, I want to conclude and hand back to you, Robert, I guess, for possible questions, and happy to discuss with you. I will stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Paul, for your presentation and your vision about strategic autonomy. I saw some questions and remarks in the chat. One started from Olivier Maas, and he was talking about Europe's sovereignty is under threat because, above all, the environmental crisis. Agree, because access to energy, natural resources is key to digital sovereignty. I'm not sure if Olivier still is in the call.
Yes, I am. Good. Hello. Yes, I wanted to know Paul's vision on it because he didn't mention at all this topic, and it's to me it's also Chefsache, or at least that's what the Commission says. So what's your point on this topic?
On energy autonomy.
Energy and natural resources.
Yeah,
natural resources, and there's this story also. If you go a bit beyond in the value chain, semiconductor, there are problems in Taiwan which are, to my knowledge, caused by water scarcity. So environmental crisis is starting to impact all the supply chain. And what's your view on that? Because Europe is largely dependent on all these things from foreign countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Olivier, is a very good question. And I think that also illustrates that, first of all, you need to do a proper analysis and understand the range of options that you have, and especially understand what you want to achieve. And so there's not a simple or simplistic answer. Like, for example, energy sufficiency. No, we are not going to achieve that just like that in Europe. There will be some dependency, and perhaps it can be reduced over time. And how do you reduce it over time? Well, that's a mix of measures that have to do with international relations, international trade, and new technologies. And Europe, I think, is betting on both. You see it with batteries also, for example, that battery autonomy is another kind of initiative where you see massive investment. We start some initiatives so that we have reduced dependency. Materials autonomy and natural resources, you mentioned that as a very interesting one. I don't have completely the detailed insight in that, but I would think that the reasoning is more or less like there is too large dependency at this moment. We have to reduce the dependency, but we don't assume that we can become completely independent because Europe doesn't have so many natural resources, and certainly not the rare earth resources. So we will need to create a mutual interdependency, meaning that even if we need to have these resources from states that are not like-minded, there's some other kind of dependency that we have with these states that makes that we can continue doing trade. So that's this open strategic autonomy approach. The gradual, the thinking in general is, I would say, more towards open strategic autonomy. So you work together with like-minded partners, but you keep it dependent. You allow for interdependency with non-like-minded parties, and you gradually move away from trying to keep your fingers crossed, the risk management approach. You become more towards having a greater degree of control. And these are things that really carefully have to be considered, because it's going to cost a lot of money. You know, Intel is investing 20 billion in a chips factory in order to have, again, a foundry in the United States. And that's only part of the money that needs to be invested. For Europe to become, to get a greater strategic autonomy already in semiconductors will cost a lot of money. And that will go at the expense of something else. And the expense of something else, again, I'm absolutely against simplistic answers in this field. This at the expense of something else can also mean we have less money for example, public services. We have less money for poverty, combating poverty. And so there are really difficult trade-offs to be made here. That's why I'm all for deepening the debate on strategic autonomy.
Okay, great. Thanks for answering this, Paul. Also, Esther mentioned about you, somewhere in your presentation, you mentioned about belong to us. But she also noted that she feels there's a huge difference in governance and control.
Yeah, it's you mentioned that, you know, the eIDs and .eu domain names, and they all belong to us, the European citizens, which is a great sort of viewpoint. But what I mean, this is my job as well. And what I encounter is that there's a lot of difference, but also a lot of frustration in the way that it's controlled, that the governance of these, you know, domain names, identifiers, eIDs is handled. And also, you know, because if you look into countries like the Nordics, you know, where bank ID is huge, one of the problems there is you can't force a bank to hand out an identity to someone who doesn't have a bank account. Mm. And, you know, quite a number of people aren't eligible for bank accounts. So that really is an issue. And similarly, you know, you can't force governments to hand out eIDs to people who they don't recognize as citizens or residents. So it's, you know, it's all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. So first of all, I think strategic autonomy perspective does make a difference here, because governments, in a certain sense, they are starting to take the role of their own national IDs more seriously. But secondly, there is also something that has to do, of course, with the, the internal legitimacy has to do with the relationship between citizens and governments. And citizens have their rights. You know, that is the basis of where everything comes from. The legitimacy of the state is coming from the citizens, and not only the citizens, but let's say the people living in that country. And you are pointing, for example, to people that may be less served in terms of these rights. And so I think we also have to look at identity, and you probably do that, as something that belongs to us. And the us is not the state. It's not the same as the state. So the us means also that there must be room to create solutions for electronic identity that guarantee sufficient rights, even if they do not come directly from the state. So self-sovereign identity is one of those important developments. And then governments can, of course, consider to what extent that they will be able to deal with these forms of identity and which types of services, and when do they want to link it to the national ID. That's then still a separate discussion, and I think that's also part of the policy discussion that we see right now happening in Europe. But what it does mean is that in both cases we are talking about a much stronger awareness of the importance of having control on ID.
Okay, great. Also another remark.
You can skip that one.
Yeah. So I also see from Rizana Oli-Pekka, and this is about Russia, where it's happening. There's going to be a turn to be triple loss. They have lost all assets in the international corporation. Not sure if you would like to elaborate more about this, Pekka.
I don't know if I have much more, but I have used Russia as example when we have discussed inside in Finland about this digital autonomy and sovereignty, what it means. If you think what the Russian is trying to do, take it from the internet, have our own mobile system, Aurora, and so on. So they lost their competitiveness, they lost the trust, they lost if they are connected outside of internet, they lost all information we have here in use. There are huge challenges in our scientific cooperation and so on. So and only win is that one guy can be strong. Sorry, you are recording this.
No, but Olipek, I understand your question. By the way, it's a great pleasure to see you again, because I saw that you were participating. It's a long time ago that we saw each other, so great to be interacting here. Yeah, so you see that this is also this kind of realism that has to sink in around strategic autonomy. So in the discussion around sovereignty in the past, Europe has been very much into this kind of game, like if you increase sovereignty at European level, it goes at the expense of the national level. Well, that's not true. So we first have to break that one. Then we have to say Europe open to the world without any conditions attached is a position of weakness rather than a position of strength. We thought that was a position of strength, but it is not a position of strength anymore in this world. But Europe close to the world, as you say rightly about Russia, is also a position that will only weaken you. So this is the challenge for Europe. You have to strike this kind of balance of having sufficient strength at home to be credible in the world, but not to close yourself off. And with whom do you then work together? And I think one of the particularly interesting challenges there is, of course, the transatlantic one. So to what extent can Europe work together with the United States? And is that a sustainable collaboration in the longer run, even if there are elections in the United States that perhaps give rise again to more America first? So how do you do that? And there again, I think it's important to have platforms where you can discuss with people that are not necessarily only within the focus of a single state, where you can discuss about these important matters that are of global interest, like electronic identification and trust services. So I think indeed we need to really learn, look carefully around us Europe and learn from how do they do it in China, what do they do right and wrong in Russia, what do they do right and wrong in the States. And that's an interesting debate, you know, because we are also getting very much to the heart of what do we think Europe is about.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Not sure if there are any other last questions. We are almost at the end of this lunch break. Well, I think you already had a good conclusion there, Paul, about sharing and learning from other countries in order to make a step forward. So I think we come to the end of this lunch break. So again, I would like to thank you, Paul, for seeing you there. I hope you can meet each other in person somewhere in the future. Hopefully then COVID-19 will be, well, not away, but we will be able to see each other. So thank you again for sharing your thoughts about this important topic.
Also a pleasure for me, and also to meet online again a number of people that I haven't met for quite some years, and I'm very happy to see that they are continuing to be active in this domain. I see Hans de Jong is there, who I didn't see for many years. Robert, of course, you yourself. It's great that we can stay connected in this, what is quite important debate. I've given in the slides a few references to papers, including a report that has recently been made for the Dutch government, who also takes digital strategic autonomy quite seriously, next to the other governments in Europe. So I think this theme will be with us for a while.
Yeah, great. So thank you again, Paul. Thank everyone for attending this lunch break. Please go to our website, IDnext.eu, for future lunch breaks or even for our annual event that will take place end of September. More information will follow. And well, looking forward to you for a new edition of IDnext. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye. And stay safe.